Beta Bells asks, is public protesting really worth it?
Nope.
Probably not, but it can be a giggle as long as there's not too many folk singers.
You should put together all the questions we just say no to and make that a podcast. It's a nice day out for some people, isn't it? So
we enjoy a good protest.
Yeah. Don't think it gives folk a false sense that they've actually achieved something, though?
Yes.
And actually they've not at all.
But nonetheless, it's also it builds a sense of community, and it's good.
I felt that was the thing about like the Trump protests that was very weird. We didn't last long at them, to be fair, but we were there.
You went to the pub.
Yeah.
Well, by the time you went to the protest, I'd left to go home and have my tea.
I'll explain why though, because like, see, I remember being at like the Iraq War March, right? And there was a little bit of venom to that. Like because we were actually like genuinely pissed off about what was fucking happening. It was a bit rawr, fuck Tony Blair. Whereas the Trump protests were weird because it was good that they happened, but it was a bit like a who's made the funniest sign contest. It was an odd tone. It was like, here's the rise of fascism, and we're just here for a bit of a day out. And like, I think when I it's almost like if you could flash back to like 1930s Germany, there'd be this kind of gathering in the middle of Berlin, and everyone's just making a wee funny side about Hitler. And I suppose that's good. It is a really good thing, but it was just interesting to me how the level of pissed offness, like the Iraq War marches, there was a very different feeling when you were there to what was present at the Trump ones.
I think that's because of the nature of Trump. I mean, the Iraq War was... God, where do you even start? I mean, I could remember watching Tony Blair and his minions tell lies about Iraq being in any fucking way a threat to us, and it being so obvious that it was bullshit. And here we were trundling in towards it, and the fucking establishment, the weight of all of that going on. And it felt like the beginning of a dystopian future.
You've got very, very angry, impassioned people that are seriously pissed off at their government. Does that not look more, we should take these people seriously? Whereas if the news coverage of the Trump protests is, look at these funny signs, he's orange, is that not kind of downplaying the threat? So when that goes out on the news, are we not kind of getting the impression of like, again, to use the Hitler comparison, Hitler's a bit daft, isn't he? But it's not actually zoning in on, no, this guy is a serious problem. And I lost interest in it quickly because it didn't feel like there was a real... It just felt like a gathering of people having a bit of a laugh. It didn't really feel like a serious, fuck this guy kind of reaction. And I felt that that's what that warranted, which concerns me a little bit because I think that's advantageous to him.
I would agree with all of that if you think that satire is going to help. I would refer you to the kind of like 1930s Berlin cabaret scene for the effectiveness of that against the rise of fascism.
It's kind of like George Bush, because like everyone loved making fun of George Bush. The guy was a war criminal though, so although he's actually responsible for thousands of people's deaths.
The problem that you have there is that the Bush presidency was, for the first 6 years of it, essentially much more of a puppet regime where you'd got Dick Cheney really running the show. And Dick Cheney was a very, very dangerous and fucking mental man. There was a strong campaign to impeach him first because, you don't want to get rid of Bush to make Cheney president kind of thing. Not that anybody fucking organised themselves to do it, but the interesting...
That's kind of the point though, isn't it? Because the emphasis was not put onto Cheney.
Yeah.
It sort of misses the humour should be targeted at like the actual
We're laughing at
problem.
the fact that, we were actually laughing at a disability because George Bush's dad, George Bush Senior, also did the same thing, which is they sort of mix words around in sentences, little malapropisms, and that's actually a sort of form of dyspraxia or dyslexia. And we're kind of essentially, I mean, it was funny, but we were all taking the piss out of something that was in fact a disability. George Bush, I'm going to say something quite controversial here. George Bush wasn't as bad a person as we like to think he was. Dick Cheney was responsible for much of it, and George Bush kind of coasted through a lot. And there was a point at which Dick Cheney had organised something, I can't remember the details of it, but he was essentially about to put American troops on the ground to handle the situation. And that's a big no-no over there, like the no standing armies administering stuff. And there was a huge fallout between George Bush and Dick Cheney. And the last 2 years, they were really at odds with each other. Cheney was sidelined. And George Bush, I feel, redeemed himself a little bit in those 2 years.
We got elected on a kind of fairly non-interventionist foreign policy.
Yeah.
And then once, 9/11 happened, then the Hawks really took over and
Yeah.
they were in control of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've always had the view of 9/11 that it's not a conspiracy or anything like that. I think what simply happened was that America got caught massively off guard.
Yeah.
And politically, it made more sense to go on the attack than admit how horribly weak their defences actually were at the time. And I think it will not have taken long for him to be talked into war and terror, George. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, more or less what happened. I don't think it's nearly as conspiratorial as people think. There is probably the connection between him and his dad in terms of Iraq and him wanting to finish what his daddy started and all that. But I still don't think it's maybe as ha ha ha.
I can't believe I've wandered into the George W. Bush apologist revisionist podcast.
I'm not saying it's not an awesome. I'm just saying that it's not something that really gets reported on.
He was a very mixed man. I mean, he choked on pretzels, but he's very good at dodging shoes. So, a lot of skills. I suppose I was thinking more seriously. The difference between as abhorrent as that kind of like administration was, it was the Republican Party, and as far out as there as they were, professional and balanced. Whereas the current one is it's like this kind of Tea Party,
Yeah.
like fucking Pepe the Frog, like
And that's
hybrid.
Yeah,
There's no
that's
case in charge.
really a product of a black man in the White House, isn't it?
Probably, yeah.
There are people who didn't know they were racist until they had a black president.
In the same way that those Trump protests, I felt somewhat missed the point that this is the sort of difficulty where we seem to be kind of attacking the symptoms rather than the illness. Is that the sort of the phrase possibly you could put to this? In the same way, if you kind of let's make fun of George W. Bush, even though Dick Cheney sat there in broad daylight as the real issue here.
Yeah.
And it's the same sort of thing with Trump. We're kind of getting distracted by the fact that he's this sort of clown, but we're not actually gunning for the serious stuff that he's doing wrong. Is that not the approach we should be having?
I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, protests serve a purpose of being a community event that makes people feel that they're not alone in their fucking despair. All right. So from that point of view, I don't think I've got any issue with them being a giggle. And we could have less folk music. I mentioned the folk music. But so, I don't have any issue with them. I do take your point that they don't necessarily serve any useful purpose in preventing the thing that you're protesting about, but they do make you feel better about that you're not alone.
Is it more the kind of, we're saying protest, but the modern thing is just more of a gathering?
Yeah.
I think the word's wrong. I think it's like a kind of gathering of anti-Trumpers. Yeah.
Protest is like it could kick off into actual violence, whereas none of these have that potential, really.
Yeah, you never had none of this nonsense with the suffragettes. They were proper protesters.